Hello everyone, and welcome to my lead book study. This is going to be the first of three videos in regards to content literacy reading. It mainly has to do out of this book. If you have this book, great, and you're able to follow along. If not, it's okay. I'm going to go over a lot of what's already in here for this lead book study, and you guys feel free to comment below. Let me know what you guys think about the book study. Obviously, what you guys think about what's going on in the text. If you feel it would be beneficial for students, or if there are other ways of doing things, easier ways, or what you would think are better ways of teaching students about content reading. This one is going to be mainly focused on nonfiction reading. It's based out of a book that my stepmother gave me. Cindy, if you're watching this, she is a former teacher. It's a student edition reader's handbook. And I'm mainly going to be pulling out of this because it's a really good resource guide for students learning how to read nonfiction in the content area. This is the first video, and we're going to mainly go over Chapter 5. And Chapter 5 has to specifically do with nonfiction reading. And I'd like to go over the focus on persuasive writing, as well as focusing on speeches and real-world writing as well. When it comes to compare and contrast, writing change over time, developing a thesis, things that students need to know when they are learning to read nonfiction, learning to pick out those viewpoints, the main idea, and using this as a resource guide as for teaching students. So, like I said, this book is a student edition. It's not the teacher's edition, but it's still a good resource, I think. And with the focus on persuasive writing, it begins on page 247. It focuses on persuasive writing as making an argument, and that it's all around us. And this is prevalent, especially in historical context, as well as historical context writing, biographies, pretty much historians trying to make a point. It could be anything from trying to prove that aliens once came to Earth to proving that George Washington wasn't all what he was cracked up to be. Mainly, it's thesis building, and I really like the goals that are set forth at the beginning here is to recognize the topic of the author's viewpoint, which I'm sure if any standardized test you have taken in the past, anything from the SAT, ACT, GRE, there's always that question in there after you read a passage, what would the author agree with? And it gives you different choices of statements that an author would agree or disagree with based on the viewpoint that they have written in the passage. And so that's a very important goal that I like how they point that out. And it also asks you to identify the 3 points of an argument. I think this more has to do with building writing, an essay structure. Usually it'll have a beginning, the middle, the end, and beginning will be an introduction into your 3 main points that support your argument or thesis, and state at least 3, and that's your basic essay structure. And just try to recognize that. For a reader to start to recognize that while reading nonfiction, it's going to be very beneficial for them starting out. And then the next goal is use the strategy of reading critically to evaluate the argument. Now this comes down to the reader thinking outside the box, thinking critically, and really trying to think for themselves based on their opinions of the argument of what the author is trying to get across. And this I believe is very important when it comes to teaching social studies and history in the content area. I always want to challenge my readers to, especially when they're going over civics, even economics, and when it comes to theory-based stuff, I really want them to question what the author is trying to write. There are several articles for past video strategies that I have made where I encourage that. And when it comes to reading nonfiction, that's what a reader should do while they are reading this stuff. So these 3 goals, when it comes to focus on persuasive writing, I think this book hits it head on at the beginning of this section. But it first tells them to start off by trying to find that viewpoint. And trying to find the viewpoint can be difficult to start off with. I mean, when you're reading the introduction, an author will sometimes go this way, that way, and they'll intermingle. But it's usually just in one sentence or in one phrase where an author will really point this out. And the book actually states that it is a statement of belief that the author wants to explain and then support. So when it comes to teaching reading in this content area, I think it's important to drive home trying to find that statement first. And it comes down to thinking while reading. I mean, this is a student does have to think a little bit harder while they are reading nonfiction, and that can be difficult for anyone. It was difficult for me, I'm sure, for anybody transitioning from fiction to nonfiction. But moving on, I like how it on the next page it kind of gives a flow chart on how usually nonfiction is structured to where you can usually find that viewpoint statement. The viewpoint statement, it says, almost always is going to be in that introduction or in that prologue of a nonfictional text, which is correct. So I like how it focuses on the persuasive writing from the get-go, noticing it. As soon as you see the viewpoint stated, you know that this is persuasive writing. So right then and there, it identifies this is what the reader needs to look for, and that this is what the reader will know what they're getting themselves into while they are reading. Also, it goes over a little brief strategy of reading critically. And in nonfiction, you have to read more critically, I think, than any other subject, just because it spans a lot and usually goes over an extensive amount of vocabulary words. The interesting fact is that I looked at the state standards here in West Virginia, and the amount of vocabulary words, it exists more in the social studies than any other subject that a student has to learn, which makes sense. But this mainly reading critically comes down to evaluating arguments than analyzing vocabulary. But the best way to read critically is to evaluate any arguments that you read. And that I think that's going to come down to asking a student a so what question. One of the texts I'm reading for this class right now by Tovani, Chris Tovani, she used that as a strategy, a reading strategy, when teaching students, asking them so what whenever they were reading something. It's just they can make a connection to the text, and that gets them to think critically. And I think that's that using this in combination with this really drives it home. But it does give supporting instructions here on what the student should be doing while they are reading, which I think is very important because we always know what to look for after reading, but if we have it while we're reading, it's going to be more beneficial for the student, and it's going to be support them, I think, a lot better while they are reading through everything. They give several examples here of authors' viewpoints, their titles, flow charts, and T-charts on how to evaluate it, mainly strategies on how to connect with the writing. And I think a lot of these viewpoints, it utilizes mainly a lot of T-charts, but I think utilizing these strategies when teaching is very beneficial. I'm sure we've used countless amounts of Venn diagrams and T-charts and webs to try to connect to the text of what the author is trying to drive home. But the focus on persuasive writing, once again, I think it's a great tool for students to use who are struggling reading nonfiction in the content area of social studies. So far, I'm looking forward to reading the next section on focusing on speeches. And this, I think, is going to mainly focus on what kind of speech we're trying to drive home, whether it's persuasive, bandwagon. I'm sure there are other points that they go over as well. But I think it's going to usually have the same structure as content. As persuasive writing. But when it comes to analyzing speeches, that's used in the social studies a lot. Everything from Martin Luther King's speech to Kennedy's speeches to Roosevelt's speeches to Reagan's speeches. That's something I plan on using a lot. And a student at least has to know what kind of speech and what kind of message is being driven home, especially when our political leaders are making current speeches. All right, so that's the end of this book study. Comment below and let me know what you think of the persuasive writing section of the Reader's Handbook. If you have this book, great. If you don't, let me know. I'll be happy to scan you some copies of the pages, and so you can follow along. Please comment below, and I hope you enjoyed this video book study.